What's up, everyone? Welcome to the NBA Slate Breakdown. I'm Jason Gilbo. Just three games tonight, flying solo on this Tuesday morning. Hopefully, it's a quiet day as far as injuries go. I mean, we don't really have a ton to really look at as far as the day goes on outside of Otto Porter, who did not practice Monday. He will be obviously one that we can talk about because that game is at 7. We'll get that news fairly early. So overall, should be pretty quiet. We got three games tonight: Cleveland, Milwaukee, Sacramento, Philadelphia, and New Orleans and Washington. Let's take a look at Sacramento and Philadelphia here first. 209 total. Philly favored by about 8.5. This is, obviously not an attractive Sacramento side here. A lot of split minutes. The backcourt's been pretty heavy. When we look at some of these guys here, it hasn't been pretty. It's been a team that we don't usually like to target, but on a 3-game slate, we might have to take some stabs with some guys here. So, first off, I do want to talk about George Hill, fairly cheap because the point guard position is fairly weak. I will make one quick statement here that DraftKings is a little bit easier to play on tonight because of the multi-position eligibility, because you don't have to fill 2 small forwards, because you don't have to fill 2 shooting guards, stuff like that. It's a little bit easier, where on FanDuel you'll see some thin positions like point guard, like small forward, like everywhere tonight. So that is one thing to note. But Sacramento back here, George Hill, I do want to talk about him, averaging 27 fantasy points per game over his last 5. He's played 28, 30, and 33 minutes in his last three-game slate here. I don't mind him. Philly, obviously 21st in defensive efficiency against point guards. They're not that great of a team defensively, even though they are holding opponents to a pretty poor field goal percentage. But overall, pretty standard against point guards here. I will take a look at George Hill, just given the fact that he is cheap. De'Aaron Fox, he does come in tonight questionable. He did practice yesterday. I kind of expect him to play. He has not been great of late. We've seen Frank Mason also get some minutes as well. Not really a thrilling play either. I think Hill's obviously your best bet out of those 3. And then kind of gets a little bit tricky here. So when we move on from the Kings there, Bogdan Bogdanovic is the guy that I'll take a look at here. 24 fantasy points in 29 minutes, averages over his last 5 games. He's shooting 50% from the field in that span. I do think he can come out and get you, 20, 25 fantasy points. 25 might be a little bit of a stretch, but I do think 20 is in the range there. We've obviously seen him go off against Toronto last time out. If he gets hot from 3, he's obviously a strong play. He put up 20 fantasy points in 22 minutes last time out against this Phillies team. Didn't shoot particularly well. I do think on a smaller slate here, given that shooting guard's pretty lackluster, that we can give a look his way. So don't mind him. As far as other options go, I'm going to jump to the front court here. I don't mind Zach Randolph. He's a little bit expensive. That's my problem with him tonight. Minutes were down last game, but that was just because of the 119-196 game. That was a blowout. Outside of that, averaging 40 fantasy points over his last 4. He did put up 36 in 29 minutes last time out. Randolph has been relied on a little bit here heavily, so I don't mind him in the spot if you have the extra cash, because he obviously is a pretty safe floor guy in comparison to some of these other guys. I just don't know if he'll be able to fit him tonight. Willie Cauley-Stein, don't mind the matchup here. He's been another one where working his way back. Obviously, the blowout in Minnesota lowered his minutes, but has played 30 minutes in 2 of the last 3 games since coming back from injury. Don't mind him. Pretty good spot here against a Philly team that does give up plenty of fantasy points to opposing centers, the 5th most in the entire NBA. Worth a look here in GPPs at his price. Usage obviously right around 20% this year, so don't mind him. Outside of that, though, it's kind of tough. Buddy Hield's a guy who can come off the bench and get hot. Don't love it, but he's kind of in the same boat as the rest of them, where he's going to play right around 25 minutes. 20, 25 fantasy points is kind of what you're looking at from this side. So a lot of ugliness on the Sacramento team, but, George Hill, Bogdanovic, some of these guys do stand out if you are looking to get some exposure, which I think you're going to have to kind of fit in some of these bigger names. So let's move on to Philly here. Obviously playing last night on a back-to-back here. We saw Joel Embiid sit out. He's going to be back tonight. It was expected. That obviously kind of lowers some of the usage for some of these other guys. Obviously, Joel Embiid is a terrific option on this slate because the Kings do struggle tremendously against centers. Second most fantasy points allowed. They're not a great rebounding team. Philly's a pretty strong rebounding team. Sacramento 29th in defensive efficiency against centers. Look at Embiid here. This is a guy who can drop, 50 plus fantasy points tonight. He dropped 50 on Sacramento last time out. Just not a good defense here. Don't mind building around Embiid tonight in GPPs. I think there's better build around options like LeBron, like Giannis in cash games. So I don't mind Embiid here in tournaments. That's kind of where I'm going to be going. He's just a little bit too expensive for me. I'm going to be trying to get in Kevin Love at my center position. I think that's the way I'm going to be going in cash games. If you're not playing cash games, don't worry about it. Build around whoever you want tonight. But going here, I think obviously Embiid's got the top option in this spot. Some of these guys are a little too expensive. I mean, Dario Saric has been playing excellent. He's averaging 33 fantasy points per game over his last 5. The minutes are high. I mean, 37 minutes per game over the last 5. Obviously, some of that is hyped up because of that OT game, but still playing heavy minutes. Covington is kind of a guy by default here, both him and Saric, where I think they are playable in this mid-range because there's a lack of options. Obviously, there's just the prices, it's going to be like, I'm trying to fit these guys in, I'm trying to get in Giannis and someone else, and it's not working. But, balanced approach here tonight. I don't think Sarge is a bad idea. I don't think Covington's a bad idea. Covington, I think, is a little bit more in play even at a higher price tag on FanDuel because it's a little bit easier to make a lineup there in terms of pricing. It's just not fun in terms of rostering some of these other guys, but worth a look. JJ Redick, always worth a look as well. Sacramento struggling team against shooting guards. We obviously look at Redick. Struggled a little bit last night, but this is a guy averaging 31 fantasy points over his last 5. Sacramento allowing the third highest three-point percentage to opposing shooters. Sorry, that was a tricky one to get out here. It's early in the morning. Give me some slack. Don't mind Redick here, bottom half defensive efficiency against shooting guards. Redick's sitting in that mid-range, so definitely worth a look there. Outside of that, Ben Simmons kind of loses his luster a little bit with Embiid back, coming off a really strong game last night. You can make the case for him, obviously, but I think at his price, I'm going to be looking at other directions. If you're building a ton of lineups, obviously get some exposure. If you're kind of wondering about Richaun Holmes here, is he still in play? You got some GPPs. I still think you can get around 20 minutes, 24 minutes, and because he's a high energy, high FPPM guy, at his price, I think he's still worth taking a shot on in GPP. So I don't mind it. Really great spot for him. In Sacramento, we might see Embiid come back and kind of get not limited, but not obviously play a healthy dose of minutes where he's playing 35. I don't think they'll need that out of him tonight. So I can see Holmes maybe cutting into a workload, maybe just a little bit, and getting some extra run here and giving him still a little bit of a break. So that's something to keep an eye on. Outside of that, not a lot of news here. Obviously, Booker out still, so that still is going to give a lot of minutes to some of these other guys. So overall, tricky game on the Sacramento side. Philly, pretty straightforward. You want some exposure to them tonight, at least at some point. New Orleans, Washington here, a game that I don't mind targeting. I do think New Orleans will kind of struggle for their price tags tonight. I think that's one thing that I am going to say. Obviously, when we look at Cousins and Davis and Holiday and Rondo and more, it's a pretty straightforward starting 5 here. Not a lot of backup depth that we need to worry about. Cousins, Davis, if you're building multiple lineups and GPPs, I think they're obviously fine. It's not a great spot for him. It's a better spot for Davis than it is for some of these other guys. The backcourt in play at their prices. Obviously, we've seen Drew Holiday pop off here for quite a few big games. I mean, he's averaging 18, 4, and 5 this season. He's been solid. Obviously, with Davis back, I thought that would hinder his performance a little bit. Didn't do it so much. He's averaging 46 fantasy points per game over the last 5. I don't mind him here in this spot. I think both him and Rondo are excellent GPP options on this slate. I'm going to be still looking at some other options a little bit cheaper in cash games to build around some of the other studs. But I think, once again, balanced approach in GPPs, you can look to make some decent cash there if these guys all pop off. Rondo, not a great spot for him tonight, but on a 3-game slate, I think you still do have to consider him. Washington, obviously, they're 10th in defensive efficiency against point guards. That's not great. Rondo's obviously minutes are high into the 30s, where he's producing at a crazy high rate, but don't mind him here. I think he's obviously a guy who at 6K, especially on DraftKings. Even FanDuel, I don't mind it. You can take a look. I think him and Holiday are obviously the more attractive options from this team at their price tags. Etuan Moore, you can still take some shots with. I think he's more of a FanDuel play for me. I prefer, Brogdon still over him. I prefer George Hill over him on DraftKings, and he's not as needed over there. But I think in terms of filling two shooting guards, you can look at Moore. Obviously, let some people down last time out, but still a guy who can get you in that 25 fantasy point range tonight. Washington does struggle against small forwards. He is logging heavy minutes at a cheap price tag, which is what we want to look at. So don't mind him tonight. I do prefer Davis over Cousins just a little bit here in terms of GPPs. A little bit easier spot for him. He's also a little bit cheaper, also at a spot of center where I look into fill other positions. I kind of rather roll with an Embiid over him. I also rather roll with a Love over him. So with that being said, I think I do rather take Davis, and Davis is only 10-1 on DraftKings. But once again, I mean, I'm looking at LeBron, I'm looking at Giannis to kind of be my guys that I build around tonight. So on the Washington side, obviously John Wall's coming back. He's still fairly cheap. If you have the cash and you want to get some exposure to him, go ahead. I don't think you absolutely need to, but it is a good spot for him. Obviously, you look at this New Orleans defense with Rajon Rondo back there. Love targeting point guards against Rondo. There's no secondary help for him. 23rd defensive efficiency against point guards. Wall's minutes have ticked back over 30. Don't mind him tonight. Like I said, he's a little bit expensive. We didn't quite get as much of a discount that where we got to use him. He's back over, he's 8,800 on DraftKings. Don't mind him, but this is a spot where, I think if you're building multiple lineups, you can get some exposure, but I am going to be looking at kind of the tier lower, especially with Eric Bledsoe in such a good spot tonight, and he's far cheaper. I do have interest in Bradley Beal here, and I think a lot of people are going to overlook him on this slate, even coming off back-to-back 40-plus fantasy point games. New Orleans, 17th in defensive efficiency against against shooting guards. Look at this Washington total, sky high tonight. Beal's a guy that I actually really do trust here. He's logging 38 minutes per game over his last 5. A shot where New Orleans does fail to protect, guys beyond the arc. I mean, 37% from the field, 46% from, 3. It's ridiculous. Sorry, those numbers are switched. 37% from 3, 46% from the field, allowing 111 points per game. Beal's an attractive option. I think all these Washington guys are attractive options here. If Porter sits tonight, obviously Oubre is going to draw the start. Mike Scott's going to be the guy that we're going to see some interest in play a little bit of the 4. Markieff Morris has obviously struggled. Scott's had 30-plus, fantasy point games in back-to-back run. I think he gets an extended run tonight. New Orleans ranks 29th against power forwards. So at 4,500 on DK, I think he's a viable option here on the slate. I think you can still look at the front court here of Gortat. I know it's not pretty, but you're going to have to pay down at some of these places and not feel great about it because it's a 3-game slate with teams that you kind of want to pay up for their studs. So it's going to happen. I think Gortat, Scott are decent 4 to 5K values on the slate, depending on what site you're looking at. The minutes are not high for Gortat, but I do think he can come in and put up 25 fantasy points, potentially even 30 in this matchup. I do think he gets some extra run there. He's going to be needed for size, so don't hate him at his price tag. I like him on DraftKings where you can play a little bit of 2 centers action tonight, so keep that in mind. If Porter does play, obviously I still think Oubre comes off the bench and plays well. I think Scott is still in play. It's just going to lower ownership for those guys. And if Porter does come back, not really looking at him. I do think they kind of take it easy with him coming back. He also did not practice yesterday, so that is something to know. If that's any indication, it might lean that he's possibly sitting here. So that opens up some of the other doors there for the value in Washington's side. Cleveland, Milwaukee next here. Obviously, this is a game that we want to talk about here. A great spot here for all these guys. I mean, this is a tremendous matchup for LeBron and Giannis, who have battled each other. We look at LeBron in his 2 games against Milwaukee this year, averaging 52 fantasy points per game. You look at Giannis. Giannis has absolutely popped off against Cleveland. He's averaged 37 real points and 61 fantasy points in 2 games. Both are nearly identical in terms of fantasy production over their last 10 games here. Giannis, 33% usage, LeBron, 31, both shooting over 50%. Floor of 52 fantasy points, a 64 fantasy point ceiling over those 10-game spans. Absolutely have no problem with either. Um, I'm gonna lean towards Giannis here a little bit tonight and use him a little bit more than I think LeBron. But I'm obviously going to get some exposure to both. Both are at a similar price tag, so you're kind of splitting hairs. But Giannis at home here is going to edge out just a little bit for me here. But obviously, you can make the case for LeBron as well. But Giannis is the guy that I'm going to be building around tonight. When you look at these secondary options here on this Milwaukee side, Eric Bledsoe obviously comes in at a very fair price tag. I think on tonight's slate where I'm going to be looking to start kind of lineups with him as well. 27% usage rate over the last 10 games. He's had a 28 fantasy point floor in that span. Cleveland 20th in defense efficiency against point guards. It's not a spot that I'm really looking to get, to shy away from. I think Milwaukee's one of the better teams to target tonight. Unfortunately, you can only do it with about 3 guys. Chris Middleton is that other GPP option. I think he's going to be a guy that definitely gets overlooked on this slate. Hasn't particularly done great against, Cleveland in terms of upside, but given the Cavs, bottom 10 fantasy points allowed to shooting guards, like Middleton's going to be an attractive option for me here, where I do look to use him quite a bit. But the other guy I do want to talk about here is Malcolm Brogdon. Still getting minutes. Still fairly cheap. He can fill a nice shooting guard role for you tonight. He's averaging 24 fantasy points in 29 minutes over his last 5 games. He's another one I think he can get a little bit more upside than some of these other guys, where I don't mind him. So, 33 minutes over his last 5. I think that's potential here to go off against Cleveland where they can run him a little bit more. In his couple of games against Cleveland this year, obviously these were different scenarios with Bledsoe, but had over 30 fantasy points. This is obviously a Cleveland defense that we can still target. So Brogdon is a guy who keep your eye on him. I do like him quite a bit on this slate. He gives you some value. He's going to get you exposure to this Milwaukee side. I don't really want anything to do with the Milwaukee front court. Henson really hasn't played great. So I'm kind of shying away here, and there's no real center spot that interests me on the Milwaukee side. It's mainly just the backcourt there, as well as Giannis and Middleton. So on Cleveland here, obviously LeBron, I don't need to talk to you too much about LeBron. I do prefer Giannis just slightly over him tonight, but obviously LeBron very much in play. Kevin Love's the guy that I have the most interest from on the Cleveland side. Obviously, the prior history here against Milwaukee, he's averaged 53 fantasy points in 2 meetings. The minutes are still right around about 28, 29. It hasn't been great, but 31% usage rate over the last 10 games. 33 fantasy point floor. Milwaukee struggles on the boards. They're 28th in rebounding, bottom 10 in fantasy points allowed to opposing centers. I think this is a spot where I'm going to be really trying to get in, Love here and get a lot of them, because this is a good spot for him in this matchup against Milwaukee that really does just struggle against centers. So Love, guy that I'm looking at. If you can get some more minutes tonight and get him back into the 32 range, obviously there's great potential that he can be one of the better points per dollar values, even at a higher price tag. So love tonight. I think if you're kind of looking elsewhere, you can take shots on Dwayne Wade and GPPs. He's going to be due back. He was resting. J.R. Smith is obviously a cheap option who's still going to see 30 minutes. Doesn't have a huge usage rate. It's right around 13%. You just got to hope that he can notch a couple steals and hit a couple threes at that point. But Jeff Green is a guy that I have some interest in here tonight. It's just mainly because he's a value option. He's averaging 25 minutes over the last 5 games, 21 fantasy points in that span. Bucks defense that's 28th in rebounding, allowing opponents to shoot 46% from the field. I think 25 minutes out of Jeff Green should be able to hit value in this spot. So don't mind it. But once again, he's kind of more just in there for salary relief. And outside of that, I'm not really looking at Calderon or Korver or Crowder or Thompson anywhere in these spots. It's pretty limited. So not a fun slate to talk about, but if you're playing tonight, obviously good luck. Check out dailyfantasycafe.com. Brent's not with me today, but he has his GPP article picks up on the site now. Cheat sheets are up as well, and we'll be back tomorrow.